This video is made possible by Mack Weldon, the most comfortable daily essential clothes you'll ever wear. Get 20% off at mackweldon.com using the promo code BRAINFOOD, one word. So in the video today, we're answering a viewer question because Jessie K asks us, how are drug-sniffing dogs trained? I mean, they don't actually have them sniff drugs, right? Sniffer dogs are a key tool in the arsenal of law enforcement to do their jobs. Trained to sniff out everything from drugs to fruit and boasting a reasonably good success rate, with one caveat that we'll get into in a moment. As it turns out, though, how these crime-fighting pooches are typically trained is a very simple process anyone can do with a bit of persistence and patience. Obviously, the first thing you need to train a sniffer dog is, well, a dog. While any dog can be trained to sniff for drugs or illegal material, some have a better sense of smell than others. Popular breeds used by law enforcement include members of the Retriever family, German Shepherds, and Beagles, all of whom have an impressive sense of smell, even by dog standards, thanks to generations of selective breeding. Once a suitable dog is selected, training it to sniff out the desired substance is a simple matter of getting the dog to associate a favorite toy with its smell. One popular toy that trainers use is a small white towel. This is easily recognized by the dog, can be cleaned to ensure the towel's scent is minimized, and in the general case, dogs love a good game of tug-of-war with said towels. After the dog learns to associate the towel with getting to have fun, the trainers begin to introduce the smell of the desired illicit substance that they'd like the dog to eventually seek out, be it drugs, chemicals used to make bombs, money, or really whatever. In fact, there are even so-called porn-sniffing dogs that are in reality trained to sniff out hidden memory cards, hard drives, and other such devices. These dogs are used in investigating hackers or those suspected of being in possession of underage pornography or the like. One such dog, named Bear, was used to help convict Subway's former spokesman Jared Fogle when the dog found such a hidden flash drive at Fogle's residence that human searchers had missed. In a nutshell, if the item has a scent, the dogs can be trained to sniff it out. As you might have gathered from this, over time the dog will learn to seek out the smell not for the smell's sake, as has often been erroneously suggested by those insinuating that dogs are addicted to drugs, but rather because they associate the source of the smell with playtime. And if you're wondering here, yes, the drug-sniffing dogs are technically trained via using actual drugs, though the amount needed here for the dogs to pick up the scent is incredibly low thanks to their exceptional sense of smell. This ensures no risk to the dog themselves, at least in training. The same cannot always be said to be the case when the dog is on duty. While rare owing to the fact that dogs are being used to find hidden drugs, it does sometimes happen where the dog may be exposed to something so toxic that even trace amounts pose a risk to them, such as what relatively recently happened in Broward County, Florida, where sniffer dogs were exposed to the extremely potent opioid fentanyl. To get around this problem, the dog's handler will keep a vigilant watch and particularly not deploy sniffing dogs at all if there are any loose drugs present. For the unseen drugs that nonetheless may be particularly potent, the handler also might carry things like naloxone with them, which rapidly reverses or blocks the effects of opioids, just in case. Once the dog has learned to successfully seek out the smell when commanded, the trainer then moves on to only giving the play reward when the dog does the appropriate action when it finds the source. For example, some sniffer dogs are trained to paw at the spot where the illegal substance is locked, but this obviously isn't ideal if the dog is searching for something like a bomb. As a result, sniffer dogs are trained to have passive and aggressive responses based on the situation. The passive response can be whatever you like, though most sniffer dogs are trained to simply sit down and/or point with their nose and freeze in these cases. As one security company who trains sniffer dogs summarizes, during the early stages of training, the sniffer dog will receive a reward when it displays any form of recognition of the target's scent. As the dog's skills progress, the reward will only be given when the dog responds with the correct reaction. For example, sit, stand, stare, down, bark, etc. With these quite simple training methods, the resulting sniffer dogs are very accurate in finding concealed items and are generally well trained enough to be immune from being fooled by strategic placement of treats or other masking scents. This all said, in real-world use, there does seem to be a major issue, given dogs have also been bred to please their masters and are exceptionally good at picking up body language from said masters. This is essentially another example of the clever Hans effect. If you're unfamiliar, this was a phenomenon observed in a horse named Hans who genuinely seemed to be able to do maths, including fractions, multiplications, and even square roots, as well as eventually learning to spell out names, among other remarkable skills. In the beginning, this was widely assumed to be a hoax, but after an independent commission confirmed the horse could really do these things, it seemed as if mankind had been massively underestimating the intelligence of horses. That is, until psychologist Oscar Funkst ran a series of experiments that uncovered the fact that if the horse couldn't see the questioner, or if the questioner didn't know the answer, the horse universally got the answer wrong. When the horse could see the questioner and the questioner knew the answer, however, the horse had remarkable accuracy in the 80 to 90% range. Thus, what was actually happening was that the horse was simply reading very subtle body language of the person conducting the experiments, none of whom were aware that they were exhibiting any such clues. Therefore, the horse was able to pick the correct answer to whatever the question was based on this. As you might imagine, sniffer dogs suffer from this same phenomenon. In support of this notion is a double-blind 2011 study published in the journal Animal Cognition, in which the dogs were tested in a scenario where there were no drugs, but the dog handlers and those observing the handlers were told there were drugs. To further attempt to trick the dogs themselves, certain food and play items were also placed about in order to entice them. The results? Well, the dogs performed well in regards to ignoring the treats, but were nonetheless uncharacteristically wildly inaccurate anyway, particularly around areas where the humans were led to believe the drugs were located. As there were no drugs, the result was simply a whopping 225 false positives by the dogs and the 18 handlers. In fact, in only 15% of the total 144 runs did a dog and its handler successfully go through the course without indicating that they'd found any drugs. Given the number of studies showing that both drug-sniffing dogs are very difficult to fool in controlled tests, and other studies like this one showing they nonetheless become quite inaccurate when the handlers are fooled, it's generally thought it's really the humans that are the problem and not the dogs. On this note, there have been lawsuits in the United States alleging that some handlers are actually training the dogs to respond to intentional subtle clues that they give so that the police can then conduct an otherwise illegal search anytime they please. In support of this notion, despite in testing the dogs being extremely accurate, one report from the Chicago Tribune noted that over a 3-year period, the dogs used during traffic stops in the suburbs around Chicago reported false positives a whopping 56% of the time. More disturbingly, that false positive rate rose to 73% when the police had pulled over someone of Hispanic descent. Although it should be noted that despite a 3-year span, the sample set the Tribune was working with of actual traffic stops where sniffer dogs were deployed was quite small, and the data they used was also incomplete. That said, during the previously mentioned study published in Animal Cognition, the experimenter was informed that 3 handlers admitted to overtly cueing their dogs to alert when the handler thought there were drugs, implying that this is something at least some handlers have trained their dogs to do when the handler thinks there are drugs present. Nevertheless, while some handlers seem to be doing this, it's generally thought that in many such false positive cases, what's actually happening is either trace amounts of drugs from past drug presence, potentially even from years previous, or perhaps even more likely, simply another instance of the aforementioned clever hands effect. It should be noted here that it wouldn't be that difficult to train the dogs to ignore handler body language when searching. The dogs can also be mostly trained to ignore ultra-low thresholds of detection. Despite this, to date, this doesn't appear to be something implemented in any sniffer dog training program that we could find. But in the end, the important thing to note in all of this is that sniffer dogs generally see their work as a game and usually work hand in hand with their best friend, sometimes having the same handler for many years. And regardless of how accurate they are in any given scenario, each and every one of them is certainly a very, very good boy. And you know what else is good? That would be Mack Weldon. I'm going to tell you about them before we get into today's bonus facts. Well, that's because many of you have written in asking if I have a lower body, and I absolutely do. And the very lower part of my body today is wearing these fantastic socks from Mack Weldon. They also sent me this wonderful undershirt. Okay, so we first worked with Mack Weldon a few months ago, and honestly, before I tried their stuff, I was kind of like, you know guys, socks are socks, t-shirts are t-shirts. I mean, who's gonna buy a premium undershirt and premium socks? You know, let me focus on the stuff people can actually see. And I gotta say it, I was wrong. I tried their stuff, it's amazing. I've had this one undershirt they gave me for months, and basically as soon as I finish with it, I wanna rush it through the wash so I can just get to it again. I don't really know how to describe it, it's just better, it fits better, it stays tucked in, it doesn't feel weird.
It's just better. Just try it and you will see. That's basically what I can say about this. Mack Weldon make premium men's essentials, and they believe in smart design and premium fabrics. They also have a super easy shopping experience. In fact, they're so confident that you'll love their stuff and that whole experience that if you don't like something, they'll give you your money back, no questions asked. Not only does it look great, but it performs well as well, whether you're working out, lounging around the house, whether it's under a shirt, whatever. Mack Weldon is making better stuff. It's as simple as that. Don't deny yourself this level of comfort. And yes, I'm now wearing a different shirt. Magic, isn't it? Get 20% off with our promo code BRAINFOOD, one word, at mackweldon.com, and you'll find a link in the description below. Let's get into those bonus facts. And I'm gonna keep wearing this ultra comfortable Mack Weldon stuff. Call it Casual Friday, even though it's Thursday. When I'm recording this, I have no idea when this goes out. Cognizant of the profile problem and the potential for rights-infringing searches when no search is warranted, a new tack has been investigated by some agencies in the form of switching to using mice. While less fun to have around than man's best friend, mice have the potential to be much more accurate than drug or bomb-sniffing dogs for sniffing things out. Another advantage of the mice, according to one security company that trains mice for such, is that they don't need to continually be motivated when not finding anything. In contrast, sniffing dogs must periodically be sent on dummy missions so they don't become bored with the game. For example, in airports, sniffer dog handlers sometimes have to ask employees to carry dummy packages loaded with drugs or some other illegal substance through security so that the dog can find them and be rewarded. The dogs must also periodically be retrained to keep their skills sharp. Mice, on the other hand, are good for about 4-hour shifts at a time with a useful lifespan of about 18 months. Further, the mice are significantly cheaper and easier to maintain. They can also be trained much faster and cheaper than dogs, and in extremely high numbers for mass and quick deployment. As an example of how the mice might be deployed, the aforementioned security company notes small containers with the hidden mice can be strategically placed at airports in locations where passengers walk by or are made to pause for a moment. When the hidden mice, possibly large groups of them, smell whatever they've been trained to alert for, they press a button alerting the authorities. This is all much less visible than the dog solution, and they're also not prone to reacting to handler bias. And now another bonus fact. You may have heard a story about sniffer dogs in the UK getting into trouble for finding sausages instead of contraband, which, while true, isn't the whole story. You see, the dogs in question were specifically trained to search for meat that could pose a health hazard or was sourced illegally. The dogs, to their credit, did find a lot of meat, it's just that it was mostly sausages. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below, and don't forget to subscribe for brand new videos just like this every day of the week. Also, do check out Mack Weldon, find a link to them in the description below. Don't forget to use that promo code BRAINFOOD. Just give it a try. Like I said, there's a money back guarantee. It's just worth it. And as always, thank you for watching.